June 12, 1944. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Normandy, France. Father Gabrielle Rousseau held her worn breviary with trembling hands as she stood in the doorway of the centuries-old stone church that had somehow survived the initial bombardment. 6 days earlier, American paratroopers had dropped from the sky like angels of liberation. Now, as Sunday morning light filtered through the shattered stained glass windows, she watched an impossible sight unfold before her eyes. 73 American soldiers, still covered in the mud and blood of battle, filing into her church for Mass. They couldn't understand a single word of French. She couldn't speak more than a handful of English phrases. Yet here they were, seeking God together in the middle of a war zone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Father Gabrielle had never imagined this moment. For 4 years under German occupation, she had celebrated Mass in whispers, hidden refugees in the church cellar, and watched her village suffer under the weight of tyranny. The Germans had forbidden public worship, confiscated church bells to melt down for weapons, and arrested 3 of her fellow priests for resistance activities. She had learned to minister in shadows, to pray in silence, to keep faith alive in hearts that had forgotten hope. The liberation had come with thunder and fire. On the night of June 5th, the sky had filled with parachutes and gliders. Buildings exploded, machine guns chattered through the darkness. By dawn, American voices echoed through streets that had known only German commands for 4 long years. The young men who emerged from the smoke spoke a language she had only heard in old films before the war, but their exhausted faces told a universal story of fear, courage, and desperate hope. That first Sunday after liberation, Father Gabrielle had unlocked the church doors expecting perhaps a handful of elderly villagers who had survived the battle. Instead, she found American soldiers waiting outside, their rifles stacked against the ancient stone walls, their helmets removed in respect. They had asked something in English, gesturing toward the church. One young soldier pulled out a small card with religious symbols. She understood immediately. They wanted to attend Mass. Her heart had soared and broken simultaneously. How could she serve them when they couldn't understand Latin prayers spoken with her French accent? How could she offer communion to soldiers who couldn't make confession in a language she understood? How could she provide spiritual comfort across an impossible divide of language and culture? But as she looked into their eyes, young men barely out of boyhood who had just survived hell, she knew she had to try. The morning of June 12th became a moment that would define the rest of her life. Father Gabrielle began Mass as she always had, with the ancient Latin words that had echoed through this church for 800 years. But something extraordinary happened. As she spoke, the American soldiers responded. They knew the Latin responses. They crossed themselves at the proper moments. They knelt and stood in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of the liturgy. These young men from farms in Iowa and factories in Pennsylvania, from mountains in Tennessee and beaches in California, knew the Mass. The universal language of Catholic worship bridged an ocean and a continent. What she didn't know yet was that 43 of these soldiers were Catholic, that they carried rosaries in their pockets alongside ammunition, that they had attended Mass in landing crafts hours before hitting the beaches, and that they had promised God and their mothers they would keep faith even in the midst of war. Corporal Maria Santos from Chicago had landed on Utah Beach on D-Day morning. She had waded through water turned red with blood, had dragged wounded soldiers to cover, had fired her weapon at enemy positions until her hands blistered. For 6 days, she had lived in foxholes, eaten cold rations, and watched friends die. When she heard that the church was holding Mass, something in her broken spirit reached for the familiar comfort of ritual and prayer. She gathered every Catholic she could find in her unit. Together, they marched to the church, weapons left behind, souls desperate. Something that felt like home. As Maria knelt in the scarred wooden pew, listening to Father Gabriel's accented Latin, tears streamed down her face. The words were ancient and universal. The ritual was exactly as it had been in her childhood parish of St. Stanislas. For the first time since leaving America, she felt safe. Not physically safe. Enemy artillery still thundered in the distance, but spiritually anchored. God was here, in this broken French village, in this damaged church, in the voice of this brave priest who had kept faith alive through occupation. Father Gabriel noticed the young corporal weeping and felt her own tears rise. She had celebrated Mass through occupation and terror, had maintained ritual when ritual seemed meaningless, had kept altars clean when the world outside was stained with evil. Now she understood why. This moment, this impossible connection between a French priest and American soldiers, this was why she had persevered. After Mass, the soldiers lingered. They wanted to speak with her, to thank her, to share something. The language barrier stood like a wall between them, but determination burned in their eyes. Christianity that she had preached but rarely witnessed so purely. Faith as action, not just words. Love as choice, not just feeling. The language barrier created unexpected moments of grace. Unable to hear confession in English, Father Gabrielle developed a system of symbolic communication. Soldiers would indicate their sins through gestures and expressions, and she would respond with benedictions that carried forgiveness across linguistic divides. The sacrament, stripped to its essence, became more powerful, not less. Absolution needed no translation. God's mercy spoke every language. Corporal Maria Santos confessed through tears in broken French, Spanish, English, and Father Gabrielle understood perfectly. This young woman carried the weight of killing, the guilt of survival, the trauma of witnessing horror. The priest held Maria's hands, spoke Latin prayers of absolution, and watched peace settle over the soldier's face. No shared language, but perfect communication of divine grace. The church became a sanctuary in the truest sense. Between battles, soldiers slept in pews, finding rest they couldn't achieve in foxholes and tents. Father Gabrielle kept the building open always, kept candles burning constantly, kept watch over these young warriors who had traveled so far to free her country. She mended their uniforms, wrote letters to their families in carefully translated English, and prayed over their wounds, both visible and invisible. The Americans responded with devotion that moved her deeply. They guarded the church during German counterattacks, ensuring the sacred space remained protected. They shared their military rations with villagers who had nothing. They treated Father Gabrielle with a respect that transcended her gender, her nationality, and her inability to communicate fluently in their language. They saw in her something universal, a servant of God who had kept faith alive through darkness. One morning, in late June, Sergeant Catherine Walsh approached Father Gabrielle with a roughly carved wooden statue. Catherine had created it during night watch, whittling by candlelight between guard duties. The statue depicted Mary holding the infant Jesus, a traditional image rendered in simple lines by amateur but devoted hands. Catherine spoke in halting French, explaining that she wanted to give this to the church as thanks. Father Gabrielle accepted the gift with tears streaming down her face. The statue was crude compared to the medieval art that had once adorned the church before German looting, but it represented something more precious than artistic skill. This was faith made manifest by a soldier's hands, devotion expressed through action despite exhaustion and danger. She placed the statue on the restored altar immediately, giving it the place of honor. From that day forward, the American Mary watched over the church, a symbol of the bond between liberators and liberated. As summer progressed and Allied forces pushed deeper into France, many of the original soldiers moved on to new battles, but they were replaced by others who had heard about the French priest and her church. Veterans told newcomers about Father Gabrielle, about the sanctuary she maintained, about the spiritual refuge she offered. Soldiers from different American units, different faiths, and different backgrounds came to experience what their comrades had described. Protestant soldiers attended Catholic Mass simply to feel the peace that emanated from this place. Jewish soldiers came to light candles and offer prayers in their own tradition, welcomed by a priest who understood that all sincere faith honored God. The church became a place where the universal human need for spiritual connection transcended all divisions of denomination, nationality, and language. Father Gabrielle discovered that her inability to speak English fluently became an unexpected gift. Without the distraction of casual conversation, she and the soldiers communicated through deeper channels. They shared silence that spoke volumes. They understood each other's tears without explanation. They connected through ritual, through music, through the ancient language of liturgy that predated modern nations and would outlast current conflicts. She learned that ministry didn't require eloquence, only presence. That comfort didn't demand explanation, only compassion. That faith could build bridges stronger than any built by engineers. Each soldier who passed through her church carried away something precious. The memory of a French priest who couldn't speak their language but who understood their souls perfectly. They would return to combat carrying her blessing, return to danger remembering her prayers, return to fear anchored by the peace they had found in her presence. Many wrote letters home describing the experience, attempting to explain to parents and sweethearts how a small French church and a determined priest had restored their faith in God and humanity. The Americans brought something to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont that Father Gabrielle had never expected: a determination to restore not just her church, but the spiritual life of the entire village. As July arrived and the front lines moved east, some units remained behind for rest and resupply. Instead of spending their few days of peace in recreation, many soldiers continued their work on the church and began helping villagers rebuild their homes and lives. Private Jennifer Coleman from Alabama organized a choir. She had sung in her Baptist church back home, and though the theology differed, music was a universal language. She gathered soldiers who could carry a tune and began teaching them Latin hymns, phonetically at first, then with growing understanding. Father Gabriel provided the sacred texts, and Jennifer arranged harmonies that blended American gospel influences with traditional Gregorian chant. The result was something entirely new, a fusion of cultures and traditions born from necessity and mutual respect. When the choir first performed during Mass, the villagers wept. For 4 years they had been forbidden to raise their voices in song. The Germans had silenced celebration, outlawed joy, punished displays of faith. Now American voices filled their church with music that spoke of hope and resurrection. The soldiers sang with passion that transcended their imperfect Latin, with conviction that made every word a prayer. Father Gabriel stood at the altar, conducting this impossible ensemble with tears streaming freely. She had preserved the faith through darkness, but these young Americans were restoring its joy. They were teaching her village to sing again, to hope again, to believe that beauty could survive evil. The transformation extended beyond the church walls. Corporal Lisa Anderson, a nurse from Oregon, established a makeshift clinic in the church basement. Working with Father Gabriel's knowledge of herbal medicine and the limited medical supplies available, she treated villagers who had gone without proper health care for years. Language barriers meant nothing when addressing pain and suffering. A wound was a wound in any language. A fever needed treatment, whether described in French or English. Together, the American nurse and the French priest developed a system of care that served both soldiers recovering from battle trauma and villagers suffering from years of deprivation. Young Thérèse Blanc, only 14 years old, had watched her mother die during the occupation because no doctor would come to their remote farm. She had grown bitter, had lost faith in both God and humanity. When she developed a severe infection that summer, her grandmother brought her to the church clinic expecting nothing. Lisa Anderson worked for 3 days to save the girl's life, using precious sulfur drugs from military supplies, sleeping beside her patient, praying with Father Gabriel through the night. When Thérèse recovered, she looked at the exhausted American nurse and the patient priest with new understanding. Faith wasn't just words spoken in church. It was action taken without expectation of reward. It was sacrifice made for strangers. It was love demonstrated through service. Partnership she had witnessed between medicine and faith, between American generosity and French resilience. Her transformation represented thousands of similar stories unfolding across liberated France. But Father Gabrielle saw it as deeply personal. This was why she had kept faith alive through occupation, so that young people like Thérèse could witness love in action and choose to carry it forward. Major Patricia Reynolds, a career officer from Texas, visited the church in August while her unit prepared for the advance into Germany. She had been raised Methodist and hadn't attended a Catholic service since a childhood friend's first communion. But she had heard about Father Gabriel from every Catholic in her command, and curiosity drew her to Sunday Mass. What she witnessed changed her understanding of faith entirely. The service was conducted in Latin by a French priest with terrible pronunciation, attended by American Catholics who responded in accented Latin they had learned as children, watched by French villagers grateful for liberation, and participated in by soldiers of various faiths and no faith who simply sought peace. Major Reynolds understood military operations, logistics, strategy, and tactics. But this was something beyond military science. This was human connection at its most profound level, transcending every barrier that usually divided people. After Mass, Patricia approached Father Gabriel through an interpreter, one of the village teachers who spoke adequate English. The major wanted to understand how this had happened, how a priest and soldiers who couldn't communicate verbally had built such a powerful community. Father Gabriel's response, translated carefully, struck Patricia like a revelation. Faith doesn't require a common language because God speaks to all hearts directly. We needed only to listen together, to serve together, to love together. The rest followed naturally. These soldiers came seeking God, and God met them here. I was simply the keeper of the door. Patricia Reynolds would carry those words through the rest of the war and into her post-war career. She would eventually leave the military, attend seminary, and become one of the first female Methodist ministers in Texas. When asked what inspired her calling, she always told the story of a French Catholic priest who taught her that ministry meant being a keeper of doors, allowing God to enter human hearts. September brought both joy and sorrow to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The joy came from continued liberation, as more of France fell to Allied advance. Villages celebrated freedom, families reunited, and normal life began emerging from years of darkness. The sorrow came from the constant rotation of soldiers. Units that had bonded with Father Gabrielle and the village received orders to move forward, to continue the fight deeper into enemy territory. The departures were heartbreaking. Corporal Maria Santos, who had attended Mass every single day since that first Sunday, knelt before Father Gabrielle for a final blessing. Through tears and fractured French, she tried to express what the Church had meant to her, how it had saved her soul when battle threatened to destroy her humanity, how the priest's faith had restored her own. Father Gabrielle held Maria's face in her hands and spoke in clear, simple French that needed no translation. "You carry God with you always. You are blessed and beloved. Go in peace, daughter, and return safely to your home." Maria would survive the war, return to Chicago, marry, raise 4 children, and live until 1998. In her home office, she kept a photograph of the church in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and a letter from Father Gabrielle that she had treasured for 54 years. Her children would donate both to the National World War II Museum after her death, ensuring that this story of connection across barriers would be preserved. As fall approached, Father Gabrielle realized that her ministry had expanded far beyond what she had imagined possible. Soldiers from across the American military, representing dozens of different faith traditions, continued to find their way to her church. Word had spread through the ranks about the French priest who welcomed everyone, who offered spiritual refuge to all who sought it, who demonstrated that faith could unite rather than divide. Protestant chaplains sent soldiers to her when they needed counseling that transcended denominational boundaries. Jewish soldiers found in her a sympathetic listener who honored their traditions. Even soldiers who claimed no faith visited the church, drawn by something they couldn't name but desperately needed. Captain Rebecca Foster, an intelligence officer from New York, arrived in October carrying a burden that threatened to break her. Her work involved interrogating German prisoners, extracting information that would save American lives, but also confronting the humanity of enemies. She had seen photographs from liberated concentration camps and struggled to reconcile her Catholic faith with the existence of such evil. How could God allow this? How could faith matter in a world capable of such horror? She came to Father Gabrielle not expecting answers, but hoping for something, anything, to anchor her spiraling despair. The priest listened through an interpreter as Rebecca poured out her anguish, her doubt, her rage at a God who seemed absent. Father Gabrielle's response was not theological argument, but lived testimony. She described 4 years under occupation, watching Germans arrest her fellow priests, hiding Jewish children in the church cellar, celebrating Mass in whispers while evil reigned outside. She spoke of moments when she had doubted, when faith seemed impossible, when God appeared silent. But she also described moments of grace, small miracles of human kindness that sustained hope, instances of courage that revealed divine presence even in darkness. "I learned that God doesn't prevent evil, Rebecca. God gives us the strength to resist it, the courage to fight it, the love to overcome it. You are God's instrument now, using your gifts to end this horror. That is sacred work, even when it feels dark." Rebecca Foster left that conversation forever changed. She would continue her difficult work, but now with understanding that faith didn't mean absence of doubt or pain. It meant choosing love and justice despite doubt and pain. She would return to the church twice more before her unit moved out, each time finding in Father Gabrielle's presence a reminder that goodness persisted, even when evil seemed overwhelming. After the war, Rebecca would become a social worker, specializing in helping refugees, directly serving survivors of the camps that had shaken her faith. She called it her ministry, though she worked for a secular agency. The French priest had taught her that ministry took many forms, all equally sacred when motivated by love. Winter arrived, bringing cold rain and continued warfare. But church in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont remained a constant refuge. Father Gabrielle maintained her schedule of daily mass, her clinic in the basement, her open door for any soldier seeking counsel or simply quiet. She had learned enough English to communicate basic comfort, though deep conversations still required interpreters. But she had discovered that presence mattered more than words, that sitting beside someone in their pain accomplished more than eloquent advice. The soldiers taught her French carols her grandmother had sung, ancient melodies that predated nations and wars. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the church held a combined service that lasted 3 hours and included prayers in 5 languages, carols in 7, and tears in every eye present. Sergeant Dorothy Miller, who had lost her brother at Normandy, read the Christmas Gospel in English. Father Gabrielle read it in French. A village elder read it in Latin. The congregation understood that they were hearing the same sacred story in different tongues, the story of God entering human suffering, of hope born in darkness, of love defeating fear. After the service, soldiers and villagers shared a meal that combined American military rations with whatever the village could provide. It wasn't abundant. The war had stripped the region of plenty, but it was joyful. Children who had never tasted chocolate received bars from soldiers' pockets. Elderly villagers who had eaten alone for years sat surrounded by young Americans treating them like beloved grandparents. Father Gabrielle watched from the church steps, overwhelmed by the scene before her. This was the kingdom of God made manifest, not in some distant heaven, but right here, right now, in the midst of war and suffering. Different nations, different
languages, different backgrounds, all united in celebration of hope, all choosing joy despite circumstances that warranted despair, all demonstrating that love was stronger than division. She had kept faith alive through darkness so that this moment could happen. Every secret mass during occupation, every risk taken to help refugees, every prayer whispered in fear had led to this celebration of light overcoming darkness. The investment of faithfulness had paid dividends beyond imagination. As 1945 began, the end of the war felt possible for the first time. Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Liberation spread across Europe. Hope replaced despair. But Father Gabrielle knew that her work was far from finished. Soldiers still came to her church, still sought spiritual refuge, still needed reminders that God remained present even in violence. She continued her ministry with the same dedication she had shown under occupation, the same commitment that had sustained her through the darkest years. Private Helen Schmid, a German-American from Wisconsin, arrived in January carrying a unique burden. She spoke fluent German and had been assigned to work with refugees fleeing the combat zone. Many were German civilians, frightened and desperate, caught between advancing allies and retreating German forces. Helen struggled with her dual identity, feeling American but bearing a German name, loving her heritage but hating what Germany had become. She came to Father Gabrielle seeking guidance about forgiveness. Could she forgive the nation of her ancestors for its crimes? Could she help German refugees while remaining loyal to America? Father Gabrielle's response came from her own experience, harboring no personal hatred toward individual Germans despite what their nation had done. We must separate people from politics, systems from souls. You help refugees because they are humans in need, not because of their nationality. This is not betrayal of America. This is the highest expression of American values. Compassion for enemies, mercy for the defeated. This is what makes your nation great. Helen would dedicate her post-war life to refugee assistance, helping thousands of displaced persons rebuild their lives. She credited Father Gabrielle with giving her permission to love both her heritage and her nation, to serve humanity without apology, to see people rather than labels. The priest's wisdom, spoken in broken English across a language barrier, became the foundation of a lifetime of service. By spring, American units began planning for post-war occupation and reconstruction. Officers visited Father Gabrielle seeking her advice on working with French communities, understanding local culture, building relationships that would last beyond military necessity. She had become an informal ambassador, helping Americans understand France and helping French villagers understand Americans. Her church had demonstrated that connection was possible across any divide, that mutual respect could be built even without shared language, that faith and service created bonds stronger than any forged by politics or military alliance. Major General Claire Hutchinson, visiting the region to assess reconstruction needs, attended Mass at Father Gabrielle's church in April. The general had heard stories about the priest and wanted to see the phenomenon herself. What she witnessed convinced her that this model of relationship building should be replicated across liberated Europe. Churches as community centers, chaplains working with local clergy regardless of denomination, service projects that united liberators and liberated in common purpose. General Hutchinson would implement these principles throughout her zone of command, creating partnerships that would ease the transition from war to peace. She credited a small French priest who couldn't speak English well, but who understood human connection perfectly. When victory came in May 1945, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont celebrated with the rest of Europe. The bell churches, silent since 1940, rang out across the countryside. Father Gabrielle stood in the bell tower with American soldiers, all of them pulling the ropes together, creating music that announced the end of tyranny and the beginning of hope. She looked out across the village, seeing homes rebuilt with American help, fields returning to cultivation, children playing without fear. This was what she had
prayed for through 4 years of darkness. This was why she had kept faith, when faith seemed foolish. The American soldiers began departing in June, returning to their homes across the ocean. Each departure brought tears and blessings, promises to right, hopes to reunite. Father Gabrielle blessed them individually, speaking in fractured English that carried perfect love. She gave each soldier a small medal of St. Christopher, protector of travelers, purchased with money the village had scraped together as thanks. "Go with God," she told them repeatedly. "You have freed our nation. You have restored our faith. You have shown us that goodness exists even in darkness." The soldiers carried those medals across the Atlantic, keeping them as reminders of a French priest who had shown them that ministry meant presence, that faith meant service, that love could transcend any barrier. Years later, Father Gabrielle would receive letters from across America, soldiers writing to tell her about their lives, their families, their continued faith. Many credited her with saving not just their souls, but their humanity. They described how the church in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont had given them refuge when war threatened to destroy their capacity for compassion, how her example had taught them that faith meant action, how the experience of worshiping despite language barriers had shown them the universal nature of divine love. She kept every letter in a wooden box, reading them when doubt crept in, when the work felt overwhelming, when she needed reminders that her ministry mattered. Father Gabrielle continued serving her village until her death in 1982 at age 93. She never sought recognition for her wartime service, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews, but the soldiers who had known her ensured her story survived. They told their children and grandchildren about the French priest who welcomed them despite language barriers, who blessed them before battle, who restored their faith when war destroyed their hope. In 1989, the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont erected a memorial plaque outside the church, honoring Father Gabrielle Rousseau, priest, healer, and friend to American liberators. Veterans traveled from across the United States to attend the dedication. Elderly women who had been young soldiers 45 years earlier, gathering to honor the woman who had shown them that faith could unite what war divided. The story of Father Gabrielle and her American soldiers stands as testament to a profound truth. Human connection transcends language, nationality, and circumstance. Faith expressed through service builds bridges that politics cannot construct. Love demonstrated through action speaks every language. In a church damaged by war, a French priest and American soldiers created something beautiful from the ruins, proving that hope persists, that goodness endures, that grace flows across every barrier we erect. They showed that the universal language of faith, spoken through ritual, service, and compassion, can unite the world.